Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 127 and I am the show's host Kyle. On this episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing several issues and current events going on in the world of foreign policy. We got some news on North Korea, U.S.-Russian relations, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, so really going to be touching on everything today. So if everybody could take the time to share the show, I think I got a really good one planned out for you. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page, The Libertarian Union. Alright, so let's start off with North Korea. What we have going on right now in North Korea is massive U.S. air war games combined with South Korea along the coast of North Korea and along the DMZ, so really right around the borders of North Korea. I believe up to 350 aircraft are in the region for these air games, and many of them dozens stealth warfighters, F-22s or F-35s. On top of this, of course, the U.S. has the long-range B-52s revved up and ready to go 24 hours a day right now, and the B-1B bombers in Guam. So certainly from combining that with the ground military force the United States has in South Korea, the troops that we have in Japan and Guam, and then the U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups right off the coast of North Korea as well. We have tons of firepower pointed at North Korea, not to mention our long-range ICBMs. So while from the perspective of Americans, this might not seem like a big deal. Oh, the U.S. is just carrying out more war games with South Korea there. It's just to make sure our troops are prepared should the wars come about. And that's just about what's going on. And it's kind of cool to see all the F-35s fly around in all these cool formations or whatever. But I think it's extremely important to take a second and then kind of try to look at this from the perspective of the North Koreans. I think if you're the North Koreans and you think about what might happen in a way that America would try a preemptive strike, a lot of it would have to do with aerial bombings and, having all these planes in the air, launching missiles, trying to take out the artillery positions that overlook Seoul, trying to take out the nuclear sites, trying to take out the Kim regime, trying to take out other strategic military positions of North Korea. And so for the North Koreans, a time like this has to be absolute fear, because if there's one thing that I think many Americans know about Donald Trump is that we kind of figure that he's a little bit unpredictable and may be the type of person that would do something that seems a little foolhardy or rash. And so if you're Donald Trump, maybe one of the things you try to do is a Trojan horse type strategy where you're able to get your entire army really right on the gates of North Korea without the North Koreans raising their guard a whole lot. And then you try to, kind of sneak in this attack and do what they kind of call a decapitation strike on North Korea in hopes that taking out the Kim regime and the nuclear sites would make it impossible for the North Koreans to fight back. And so they would kind of just capitulate what the U.S. needs from there. And so while I've, always predicted on the show that I think an outbreak of war between the U.S. and North Korea was unlikely and not an immediate threat, at times like this, I think it's certainly worth stopping and paying attention to what's going on in North Korea, just because the littlest kind of radar malfunction may be what sets off the, kind of string of command in North Korea, where they end up launching a missile against the United States in the belief that the United States was launching a preemptive attack against North Korea. If you look at the, kind of the height of the Cold War intentions, a lot of it wasn't necessarily worrying that either the United States or the Russians would strike first, but that, a flock of birds on a radar screen would look like a bunch of ICBMs coming over the horizon, and the Americans or the Russians end up launching weapons or some other type of miscommunication, whether it be code or human error. We end up launching these nuclear weapons and everybody in the world's dead on what was just simply a mistake. This has been recognized by two people. One I have a lot of respect for, one I don't. The person I have a lot of respect for is Peter Van Buren, who's been writing at the American Conservative a lot of really good articles about the State Department, how the State Department really isn't falling apart, but has been disempowered by the military and the Defense Department within not only the Bush and Obama administrations, but now into the Trump administration with the poor treatment of Rex Tillerson. While I'm certainly not a supporter of Rex Tillerson, and it's amazing that the former Exxon CEO may possibly be the United States' best option for Secretary of State right now, that may be what we have with Rex Tillerson, as, he is one of the least hawkish people on North Korea and has made several attempts to negotiate with the North Koreans, all the while being undermined by the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself at times tweeting out, Rex Tillerson, give up on it. From McMaster's perspective, if he thinks war with North Korea is going in the right direction, by the way, McMaster is the one I don't respect, that has the position that America is moving towards war with North Korea. He has a lot of ability to try to stop it. I think it's quite obvious to any observer that the North Koreans are not going to meet what the Americans are saying down right now as their demands in order for them to lift sanctions and military threats against North Korea, and that's for North Korea to give up their missiles and their nukes, and then Americans will talk. However, as Peter Van Buren points out, and I've pointed out on the show several times, is that the Wikipedia page for Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein will talk the North Koreans out of this 100% of the time. The North Koreans will not disarm while the Americans are playing war games on their borders. The North Koreans will not disarm while Trump is tweeting fire and fury. The North Koreans will only disarm, and if they ever do, and that would be after the Americans have backed off and agreed not to attack the North Koreans and withdrawn some troops and some bombers and some threats against North Korea. And as I was saying before, if McMaster is the, kind of guy that, recognizes this threat, he could do a lot about it. He could be talking to Donald Trump and saying, hey, look, what we're saying now for the North Koreans, what we want from them isn't good enough. And if we walk back the hostilities, Donald, then maybe we can make some progress here. So again, in this case, really, everybody, just try to take the second. And anytime you're talking to somebody about this, ask them, take the perspective of the North Koreans for a second. Imagine that if maybe the Chinese right now were working with the Mexicans and were conducting massive war games with Chinese fighter jets and Mexican fighter jets on the U.S. southern border, Americans would absolutely lose it and think this was going to be a preemptive strike against America. So think about it from that perspective. U.S.-Russian relations stuff, of course, right now my concern is the kind of spiral. We had legislation Russia passed that was forcing Radio Free America or Radio Free Europe and then Radio America, both kind of U.S. propaganda stations in Eastern Europe dating back to the Cold War, who report absolute trash news and are 100% supportive of the coup government in Ukraine and all that. Russia forced them to register as foreign agents after the U.S. State Department forced RT to register as a foreign agent. So kind of this tit for tat thing. And as we talked about before with U.S.-Russian relations being in a downward spiral, this is the way it goes, because now the State Department is condemning Russia for doing it. So hopefully we could kind of ease the U.S.-Russia tensions right now. But again, heating up here just like in North Korea. We also have in the new NDAA that Trump is about to sign $14.4 million to improve hangars on an Icelandic base that the United States used during the Cold War in an attempt to track Russian submarines coming from their northern fleet. They talk about that the path that this base will monitor from Iceland is the path that the Russian, I believe, aircraft carrier took to get from northern Russia to the Mediterranean Sea in order to carry out the airstrikes in Syria. So again, look at it. Like, how are we moving back towards the Cold War? This was that terrible, terrible idea that everybody wanted to get out of, and thank God once the Soviet Union was gone. But look, the United States is doing all these things that we only did back in the Cold War days. We have OPEC announcing that they're extending oil cuts through 2018. I thought this was a pretty big announcement. OPEC is a group of countries that, while they produce a lot of oil and therefore, kind of control a lot of world power, they all have differing views and conflicts and problems with each other. And in the past, it always seems like OPEC has a trouble getting along, and these deals usually fall apart. But things must be going pretty well for that there. So that's very interesting. And as we'll see, it's really interesting because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have formed their own coalition. They just announced that, I believe, yesterday, after the GCC is kind of falling apart with the split between Qatar and the rest of the GCC, and that Oman and Kuwait aren't necessarily going along with everything that the Saudis and the Emiratis want. In Honduras, we have an announcement that the Hernandez government is still leading the partial election recount. I don't know why you would ever have a partial election recount. This seems like the most ridiculous thing to me. Everybody knows the election was super corrupt, and they should make some changes and then hold a new election to avoid further corruption, but unlikely to happen. And it looks like the Hernandez government will remain in power in Honduras. Some of the other big news, and that is in Israel, we had the United States and Trump announcing plans to move the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and then the United States recognizing Jerusalem as the only capital of Israel. I don't know if this is like an official death blow to the two-state solution of Israel to have an actual Palestinian state, but that I think that notion was long gone. But this has really upset the Palestinians, who have largely been forced out of Jerusalem. Right now, we continue to have settlement expansion in Jerusalem that's violating international laws and has been condemned by the UN, even over the lobbying of Jared Kushner and Sheldon Adelson and Michael Flynn. At least one very significant part of this is the Arab states seem to not be making too big of a fuss out of it, while the Palestinians, and there will probably be some popular protests in some of these Arab states, as a lot of the people in the Arab world don't like the way the Israelis treat the Palestinians. It doesn't look like any government is going to put up a big stink about this. Of course, the significance is that the Americans are the world empire, and we're the ones that have backed and empowered the Israeli government all these years, likely the country that gave the Israelis nuclear technology. And so that's really why this move has significance. I think a lot of people kind of scratch their heads and ask, well, why would it really matter if the United States says that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel? Not, and it's because the United States just wields so much power on the international stage, especially through, kind of the proxy force of the UN. Why would Trump make this move? A lot of it probably has to do with donations from Sheldon Adelson. Even congressmen like Chuck Schumer support this and push for it, so it's kind of a bipartisan thing. Everybody's paid off by the Israeli lobby in the U.S., and so they're finally able to cash in all their donations for this big announcement. I also just wanted to mention that there were some reports of a missile fired from the Sinai into Israel. Apparently, these reports are incorrect, and it was an Israeli radar malfunction that indicated that there was the missiles fired. I mean, from the perspective of the Palestinians, this is kind of just like being trampled on over and over again. The Israelis are already slowly eroding away your presence in Israel. You're being forced into other countries, living as refugees. Your multi-generational family, tribal home going back decades and decades is being, eroded away and taken away from you, and roads are built and settlements are built there, and, you being a Palestinian, you're not even allowed on it. And so this is, one of those ultimate insult kind of things. The treatment of the Palestinians has long been a case and a motivation for jihadists or just different radicals to motivate them to carry out attacks against the United States. I believe the man who apparently killed Bobby Kennedy was a Palestinian, upset about the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians and the U.S. backing for it. Of course, that was something that Osama bin Laden also cited as a motivating factor. In Lebanon, we have the Prime Minister Saad Hariri announcing that he will withdraw his resignation as Prime Minister and will remain as Prime Minister. He says this is because Lebanon adopted or reaffirmed their commitment to remain neutral in other Arab affairs. Of course, this is kind of his move or his attempt to save face after going to Saudi Arabia and announcing his resignation. This likely occurred, of course, at the hands of Mohammed bin Salman, and he was the attempted puppet master in this situation. My speculation and my idea is that Mohammed bin Salman was hoping to provoke an overreaction from Hezbollah to either get the Israelis or the Americans to attack Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and force Hezbollah out of Syria to try to help the Saudi-backed jihadist Syrian rebels. And also, to kind of curb Iranian influence in southern Lebanon. Of course, the Hezbollah did not take the bait. They said, hey, no, bring Hariri back home. We like him. Let's keep the government the way it is. I'm guessing that this resolution or this idea that Lebanon is reaffirming their commitment to stay neutral is nothing but kind of a save face rubber stamp move, and things really aren't going to change. I think Hezbollah will still be active in Syria to the extent that they are now, and is strategically advantageous for them to. I think one of the few long-term effects of this will be kind of a delegitimization of Saad Hariri in Lebanon. If you're a Lebanese citizen, somebody who supported Hariri, it looks very much like he's just a Saudi sock puppet, and he's kind of been exposed as such by Saudi Arabia, pulling him back and forcing his resignation. And so I think that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind going forward when we look at how Saad Hariri is looked at in Lebanon. In Yemen, of course, we had the big news being the death of Salah and the fallout from that. Apparently fighting is still going on in Yemen, mostly around the city of Taiz, Mocha, and the capital of city of Sana'a. The fighting going on is likely between either Houthi forces and Houthi forces looking to take advantage of the Salah Houthi split, and then forces still loyal to Salah even though Salah is dead. We have a massive amount of Saudi airstrikes going on in the capital city of Yemen, hitting tons of just civilian and humanitarian targets. Of course, this is after days of intense fighting in the capital city of Sana'a, and people not having really any food or water during those days and living in absolutely deplorable conditions. And so the civilian casualties are really racking up, and the toll it's taking on the people of that city is, just increasing ever so much as time goes on. Iona Craig wrote a really good article that I think you all should check out, and I'll link to in the show notes page, detailing some of the stories of children coming out of Yemen and the absolutely horrors that they are facing. That's something I hope to detail more on the show one of these days, is just maybe about kind of the long-term effects of these, especially long wars, on the children of the countries. We also had an announcement that the U.S. missile defense system in Saudi Arabia likely did not intercept the Houthi missile fired at the Riyadh airport. It looks like that missile actually did strike and explode. It just missed its target. And then some good news coming out of Yemen is we have Donald Trump, just before I came on to record the show, actually announcing that he is calling on Saudi Arabia to lift the humanitarian blockade of Yemen. So this is only part good. What we need in Yemen for people to stop suffering, dying, and starving to death is for the Saudis to allow commercial ships into Yemen, because there's simply not enough food aid and medical aid to serve everybody in need. However, if the, central banking aid cooperates, a lot of food could come into Yemen commercially, and this will allow trade and people to, eat cheaper food and everything like that. And that would be a great thing, because a lot of people would not starve to death that otherwise would. Also, the United States is still backing Saudi Arabia's war against the Houthis in North Yemen. However, that Donald Trump is finally taking notice in Yemen is huge. And let's not forget, Obama let this catastrophe go on and, originally kicked out the support for Saudi Arabia here. And it's absolutely amazing that we had this huge humanitarian catastrophe, and the one two presidents that oversaw it and did something was Donald Trump. In Somalia, we have an updated total to the October, I believe, 18th suicide truck bombing in Mogadishu. 512 people died in that attack. That's an absolutely astronomical number. I mean, if you look at the reaction of what happens in America when just a fraction of that many people dies. I mean, we had one woman murdered by a immigrant in California, and we had a whole law passed for that. If a child dies in the United States, we'll pass a law to try to prevent that from happening again. Here in Somalia, we have 512 people, and nobody even really cares about that in the West. As I've talked about in the past, it may have been a U.S. raid that set off the string of events that really got the ball rolling here. The massacre of those civilians in Somalia may have been what drove the bomber to carry out this vicious and cruel attack. In Afghanistan, we're having more U.S. airstrikes carrying, and this is leading to a lot more deaths. A part of that could be is because the more U.S. airstrikes are coming in the same number of amount of flights flown, suggesting that the Americans are being a little bit more indiscriminate with their bombing, whereas before, a lot of times if a plane went on a shorty to go drop some munitions, it would drop maybe 2 bombs. Now they're dropping about 3.5 per mission. We also have all these airstrikes on the drug trade in Afghanistan, and I think this is going to be a huge problem for the Americans. Of course, we've tried this policy in the past, but it didn't work. But now if we're targeting these opium fields, this is a lot of what just helps the Afghan population survive. This is the country's biggest export. And so by destroying the opium crops, you're taking away the financial livelihood for a lot of people. And also, if you look at the kind of people that are farming opium now in Afghanistan, it's not these evil kingpins or drug cartels. It's just the average daily job. I mean, this is the majority of the Afghan economy. So everybody's an opium farmer in Afghanistan. And if you look at this from the perspective of the Afghan people and say, why would they all farm opium? Well, one of the other things that could grow in the region is fruit trees. However, fruit trees take several years before they produce, and if you're living in a war zone, your time preference is going to be pretty short. So where an opium crop, you're going to be able to sell at the end of the year. For a fruit tree, 5-10 years, even more before that fruit tree is producing, you really don't have the time to put in that investment. Also, the security and the stability to put in that investment. If you think the United States may blow up your tree grove 3 years down the line, well, then you wasted those 3 years and all that capital you invested into those fruit trees. We also have some fighting breaking out between ISIS and the Taliban in northern Afghanistan. A lot of people always say, well, if the U.S. leaves, nobody's going to fight the jihadists there, but obviously that's untrue. In Syria, I think the big news is that we had some missile fire traded possibly between Israel and Syria. We certainly had Israel launching a couple missile strikes against Syria, some of those hitting possibly Iranian forces. One part of the story, to me that suggests that Iranian forces were killed is that the Russians actually attempted to intercept the missiles and possibly intercepted 2 or 3 of the 5 targets. However, missile interceptions at that rate I think are pretty uncommon, so they may have been inflating the number as the U.S. usually does. I read stories that Syria responded by shooting some missiles towards Israel. I'm not sure if that actually happened or not. And then we have Israel carrying out more strikes in Syria on targets outside Damascus. We have a pretty good idea that the United States once had about 25 troops in Syria now. We had the 400 artillery marines leave Syria after, I guess, the big campaigns against cities are done. Raqqa has since been flattened and liberated from ISIS, largely by this artillery. So those Marines have left, but now we have 2,000 troops in Syria. So it's always amazing how the numbers are so much higher than they ever say before. And we had a very interesting interview I will link to, and that is, we have a former spokesman of the SDF. This was an Arab spokesman in the SDF, a general by the name of Silo, who gave a lot of interesting stories into how, for most part, the Arab branch of the SDF were just armed procurement forces for the YPG and the PKK, and that the YPG and the PKK are tied a whole lot closer than America likes to admit. This is, of course, a problem for the U.S. because Turkey hates arming the PKK, who they see as a terrorist group, and Turkey is currently fighting more or less a war against the PKK right now in northern Syria, Iraq, and then in and we also had the Pentagon saying that U.S. forces will stay in Syria as long as they need to. Looking at this from the perspective of the Syrian civilians, I mean, they're not even announcing when they're going to go, so it seems like they're going to stay forever, and I'm sure this is going to upset a whole lot of people and create a whole lot of problems for the United States down the road. Alright, that's where I'll wrap up my show for today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, the Libertarian Union on Facebook. You can check out my show and my news roundups at kylesfilesball.com or at the Libertarian Institute, and I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks, everyone.